My mother-in-law came to visit the house my parents bought for me after 22 years of hard work. When my husband started setting aside rooms for his family and asked me for the keys, I stood up with a smile and said something that made his mother's face drain of all color. My name is Maya. I am 32 years old, and before I tell you exactly what I said, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to put entitled in-laws back in their place. I looked at the stack of papers on my coffee table and then up at my husband's flushed, angry face. Before I could even ask how he managed to magically attach his name to a property my parents bought outright in cash, his brother-in-law decided it was time to step in. Brad stepped forward, crossing his arms over his tailored vest. He wore that familiar, arrogant smirk he always reserved for moments when he felt he needed to educate the less fortunate. To him, I was just another uneducated obstacle. "Now, Maya, let us take a deep breath and look at this logically," Brad said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. He walked over and placed a heavy hand on Marcus' shoulder, casting himself as the voice of reason. "You are getting emotional, and I understand that. But the law does not operate on emotion. The law operates on paper. And on paper, Marcus is your husband. In this state, marital assets can be leveraged to secure essential capital. Marcus came to me because he was in a desperate financial bind. My firm graciously provided a $2 million loan to bail him out." I stared at Brad, my expression entirely blank. "You used my parents' home as collateral for a $2 million loan?" I asked, my voice steady despite the roaring in my ears. Brad chuckled, a soft, condescending sound that made Chloe smile brightly. He picked up the top document and pointed to the fine print. "Not just used it, Maya. We legally encumbered it. I know financial literacy is not exactly a priority in the neighborhoods where you grew up. I am sure your parents did the best they could, but in the real world, husbands manage the large assets to protect the family. You should actually be thanking Marcus for generating capital." Eleanor nodded, her pearls clicking against her collarbone. "Exactly," she agreed, her voice echoing through the living room. "Women like you always want to play the victim when men step up to lead. You sit in this house all day picking out paint colors for your little freelance consulting hobby, while my son is out there navigating high finance. The least you can do is contribute the roof over your head." I turned my gaze back to Marcus. "Is that right?" I asked. "You forged my consent to mortgage a house that does not belong to you to cover up whatever financial mess you made at your firm." Marcus scoffed, stepping closer to me with his chest puffed out. "Do not use words you do not understand, Maya. Nobody forged anything. You signed a blanket power of attorney right after we got married, remember? You trusted me to handle the grown-up business. Now my firm is restructuring and I needed a bridge loan. Brad was generous enough to underwrite it. If you try to fight this, the bank will foreclose on the house entirely. So hand over the keys and start moving your clothes out of the master suite. My mother needs the morning light for her joints." Chloe giggled, linking her arm through Brad's. "Do not make this harder than it has to be, Maya. We are family now. Besides, Brad already ordered a custom Italian leather sofa that is going to look perfect right where you are standing." They all looked at me, waiting for the inevitable breakdown. They expected me to scream, to cry, to throw myself on the floor and beg them not to take the only thing I had left of my hard-working parents. They expected the emotional, chaotic stereotype they had painted me as since day one. Instead, I let out a soft breath and smoothed the front of my shirt. I did not shed a single tear. I simply looked at the documents on the table, memorizing the specific notary seal stamped at the bottom. "I will be right back," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. I turned around and walked away, leaving them standing in the living room. Marcus called out after me, telling me I had 24 hours to clear out the master bathroom, but I tuned him out. I walked past the guest rooms they had already claimed and went straight to the back of the house, to the room they thought was my simple interior design studio. I locked the heavy deadbolt behind me. The room was dark and quiet. I walked over to the modest writing desk, pushed a concealed button under the rim, and watched as the false back panel slid open. Two massive curved monitors hummed to life, glowing with complex financial dashboards, secure server gateways, and real-time global market feeds. I sat down in my ergonomic chair and placed my hands on the encrypted keyboard. Eleanor, Chloe, Marcus, and Brad thought they had outsmarted a naive freelance decorator who did not understand money. They had no idea that my parents' house belonged to a holding company. They had no idea that I was not a struggling consultant picking out curtains. I was the founder and sole chief executive officer of Apex Development, a commercial real estate empire. I kept my wealth entirely hidden, wanting a husband who loved me for me. But they declared war on my peace. I accessed the database to destroy their entire lives. 2 days later, the stifling heat of a Georgia evening pressed against the stained glass windows of Greater Zion Fellowship. This was not just a church, it was the epicenter of Atlanta's elite society. Eleanor had spent her entire adult life clawing her way to the top of its social hierarchy. Tonight was the annual charity gala, and Eleanor had made it perfectly clear that my absence would be seen as an unforgivable slight against the family. I was expected to play the role of the dutiful, grateful daughter-in-law. I stood near the entrance wearing a simple black dress while Eleanor glided through the room wrapped in shimmering gold silk. She intercepted me before I could even reach the coat check. She shoved a stack of glossy auction programs into my chest. "Hand these out to the VIP tables, Maya," she ordered without looking at me. "And make sure your posture is straight. You are representing Marcus tonight. Oh, and your seat is at table 19. We needed the main tables for the platinum donors." Table 19 was pushed entirely out of the main ballroom situated right next to the swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen. Waiters rushed past me carrying heavy trays of champagne and roasted lamb, knocking my chair every few minutes. I took my seat in the dim lighting, folding my hands in my lap. I watched the main table where Marcus, Brad, Chloe, and Eleanor sat laughing and drinking imported wine. They looked like royalty presiding over their kingdom. They thought I was sitting in the shadows nursing a broken heart over my stolen house. They had no idea I was sitting back to watch the first domino fall. Eleanor tapped her silver spoon against her crystal flute. The chatter in the grand ballroom hushed as she made her way to the podium. She adjusted her heavy diamond earrings and beamed at the congregation. "Brothers and sisters, we are so blessed tonight," Eleanor began, her voice echoing through the massive sound system. "God has truly smiled upon the Blackwell family. As many of you know, my son Marcus and his brilliant wife Chloe, alongside her husband Brad, are expanding their territory. They are moving into a magnificent new estate in Buckhead. It is a testament to what hard work and divine favor can bring to a family that walks in the light." The congregation clapped enthusiastically. From my vantage point near the kitchen, I could hear the whispers of the wealthy church board members sitting at table 18 just a few feet away from me. "It is about time Marcus moved his family into a proper home," Sister Jenkins murmured behind her program. "I always felt bad for him having to live in that old property Maya inherited." Deacon Hayes nodded, sipping his ice water. Maya's parents were good people, but they never understood the vision of this elite church. They pinched pennies and gave the bare minimum to the collection plate. You cannot build a thriving community with a poverty mindset. Eleanor is practically doing a public service by taking over that property and putting it to good use. I gripped the edge of my wooden chair. My parents had worked 80-hour weeks and donated their free time to the community soup kitchen instead of buying $1,000 gala tickets to show off. This church had shunned them for not funding the pastor's private jet, and now they were applauding my mother-in-law for orchestrating the theft of my parents' legacy. The sheer audacity of their classism burned in my chest, but the anger kept me grounded and focused. I did not need to scream at them. I just needed to look at my watch. It was exactly 8:15. Brad stood up, taking the microphone from Eleanor. He adjusted his tailored jacket, smiling out at the crowd of influential professionals who trusted him with their money. "As a private equity manager, I recognize the value of community investment," Brad said, his voice slick and practiced. "Marcus and I are partnering on a new venture. We are leveraging our real estate assets to bring unprecedented growth to this congregation." As Brad continued his long monologue about financial literacy and wealth building, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open. A man in a sharp gray suit walked in carrying a secure leather dispatch bag. He was not a guest. He was a courier for the Federal Banking Authority. I picked up my porcelain teacup and took a slow, measured sip. The courier navigated through the maze of decorated tables, bypassing the security volunteers who tried to stop him. He walked straight up to the platinum donor table at the front of the room. He pulled a sealed, bright red envelope from his bag and handed it directly to Marcus. The ballroom was large, but the sudden shift in energy at the main table was palpable. Marcus frowned, setting down his expensive wine glass. He tore open the seal and unfolded the thick legal document inside. I watched his eyes scan the first few lines. In an instant, the smug, arrogant expression he had worn all evening completely vanished. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost in a tailored tuxedo. Brad leaned over, attempting to read the document over Marcus' shoulder. "What is it?" Brad whispered sharply. Marcus' hands began to shake so violently that the thick paper rattled. The loan, he choked out, his voice carrying just enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "The $2 million collateral loan. It has been frozen." Brad snatched the paper from his hands. His eyes widened as he read the bold red text printed across the top of the banking notice. The funds had not just been frozen. The massive loan had been flagged for institutional fraud by an anonymous corporate whistleblower. The bank had locked all of Marcus' accounts, initiated an immediate asset freeze, and alerted federal regulators. The bridge loan Brad had so generously underwritten, using my forged signature, was now a federal crime scene. Eleanor turned around from the podium, her fake smile faltering as she saw her son gripping the edge of the table, looking as though he might be sick. The congregation fell into a confused silence, watching the Golden family unravel in real time. From the shadows of table 19, right next to the noisy kitchen doors, I set my teacup back onto its saucer. I smiled. I watched the panic ripple through Marcus as he stared at the red federal notice. The pristine facade of the charity gala melted away. Eleanor quickly signaled the church band to play a loud gospel track, desperate to distract the wealthy donors from her son's sudden lack of composure. Marcus crumpled the paper, shoved it into his tuxedo pocket, and grabbed Chloe by the arm. They practically ran toward the valet exit, leaving Brad to awkwardly excuse himself from the podium. I took one last bite of my lemon tart, wiped my mouth with the linen napkin, and followed them out into the humid Georgia night. The drive back to our house was suffocatingly quiet. Marcus gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. Sweat beaded at his hairline. He kept checking his rearview mirror as if expecting flashing federal lights to appear out of the darkness. I sat in the passenger seat, playing the role of the oblivious, loyal wife. "Is everything all right, sweetheart?" I asked, letting my voice sound soft and naive. Marcus snapped at me, telling me to mind my own business, and that corporate finance was too complex for me to grasp. I just nodded and turned my head toward the window, letting the streetlights hide my grin. By 2 a.m, the house was completely silent. Marcus thought I was asleep. I lay perfectly still, listening to the shallow, erratic rhythm of his breathing. He slowly slipped out from under the heavy down comforter and grabbed his phone from the nightstand. The faint blue light illuminated his desperate face as he paced the length of our master bedroom. He was cornered. The bank had frozen his primary assets, and he needed liquid cash to hire a defense attorney or pay off whoever was threatening to expose the rest of his fraud. My personal phone vibrated against the mattress near my hip. It was a silent notification. I slid my hand under the covers and tapped the screen. A fraud alert from my private banking app glared back at me. A withdrawal of $50,000 had just been initiated from our joint checking account. It was the account where I deposited my fake interior design earnings to keep up the charade of my modest income. Marcus had just drained every single penny I had put in there. He was stealing from his own wife in the middle of the night to cover the tracks of a loan he secured by forging her name. I reached over and flicked on the bedside lamp. The sudden bright light made Marcus jump. He nearly dropped his phone, scrambling to lock the screen. "What are you doing awake?" he demanded, his voice cracking with unearned authority. I sat up against the headboard, crossing my arms. "I could ask you the same thing, Marcus. And while you are answering that, You can explain why $50,000 just vanished from our joint account. Marcus blinked, his corporate mask slipping right back into place. He let out a harsh, dismissive sigh and tossed his phone onto the mattress. Maya, you are being ridiculous. It is a simple routing error. The bank is doing a routine sweep on my corporate accounts, and it temporarily affected our joint funds. It will be reversed by morning. Go back to sleep. I did not move. A routine sweep does not initiate a wire transfer to a private offshore account. At 2 in the morning, I said, keeping my voice deadly calm. Put the money back, Marcus. He scoffed, running a hand over his face, acting as though my questions were a massive inconvenience to his important life. You are always so financially anxious, Maya. It is exhausting. I am a chief financial officer. I manage millions of dollars before breakfast. Do you really think I need to steal your little decorating money? He walked over to my side of the bed, leaning down so his face was inches from mine. This is exactly what my mother was talking about. He sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. You have that same poverty mindset your mother had. She spent her whole life scrubbing baseboards and hoarding coupons because she was terrified of going broke. You grew up watching your parents count pennies at the kitchen table, and now you panic over a standard banking delay. You are holding on to a working-class mentality, Maya. You need to grow up and let the men handle the real wealth. The mention of my hardworking mother triggered a fire deep inside my chest. My mother had calloused hands and a tired back so she could build a foundation of genuine wealth for me. She did not steal. She did not forge signatures. She did not lie. Marcus was standing in the house my parents paid for, wearing clothes bought with dirty money, having the audacity to insult the very woman who provided the roof over his head. I felt a cold, sharp rage settle into my bones. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I simply looked at him and smiled, a hollow, terrifying smile. You are absolutely right, Marcus, I whispered. I should leave the real wealth to the professionals. Good night. Marcus exhaled a heavy breath of relief, thinking he had successfully gaslit his naive wife into submission. He crawled back into bed, and within minutes his exhaustion overtook his panic. He began to snore lightly. I waited until I was certain he was in a deep sleep. Then I quietly slipped out of bed, grabbed my laptop, and walked into the master bathroom, locking the heavy oak door behind me. I sat on the edge of the marble bathtub and opened my computer. I bypassed the standard login screen, entering a series of complex passwords that connected me directly to a secure server in the Cayman Islands. The screen loaded, displaying the primary holding account for Apex Development. The balance glowed in bright green digits, showing $15 million in fully liquid, untraceable capital. I pulled out my secure phone and dialed a number I only used for emergencies. My lead corporate attorney answered on the first ring despite the late hour. I did not bother with pleasantries. Find every single piece of debt tied to Brad's private equity firm, I ordered, my voice echoing softly against the bathroom tile. Every bad loan, every over-leveraged property, every cent he owes to his investors. I want you to buy it all. Do whatever it takes. I want to own them completely by Friday. I ended the call and closed my laptop, the soft click echoing in the master bathroom. I sat in the dark for a moment, letting the reality of what I had just set in motion wash over me. By Friday, Brad would no longer be the arrogant private equity manager pulling the strings of my life. He would be my employee. I slipped back into bed next to Marcus, my breathing as steady and calm as a predator waiting in the tall grass. When morning came, I played my part flawlessly. I poured Marcus his black coffee, listened to his fabricated complaints about a stressful morning at the corporate office, and kissed his cheek before grabbing my modest tote bag. I told him I had a full day of interior design consultations across town. He barely looked up from his phone, waving me off with a dismissive flick of his wrist. I actually spent the day at the Apex Development headquarters finalizing the hostile takeover of Brad's firm and ensuring Marcus was completely boxed out of his own accounts. The sky had turned a bruising shade of purple by the time I drove back to the neighborhood, a torrential Georgia downpour washing over the windshield. As I turned onto my street, my headlights illuminated a massive white moving truck parked illegally across my driveway. My heart slammed against my ribs. I pulled to the curb and stepped out into the freezing rain, my eyes locking onto the scene unfolding on my front lawn. 4 men in matching gray uniforms were hauling heavy boxes through my front door. The heavy brass lock I had installed myself was shattered, the door frame splintered, and hanging by a single hinge. But that was not what made my breath catch in my throat. Sitting on the concrete curb completely exposed to the relentless rain was my parents' antique oak dining table. The wood was already warping under the deluge, the rich stain my father had applied by hand, running down the carved legs. My father had spent 6 months in our tiny garage building, that table from scratch. His hands were always blistered and covered in sawdust, just so my mother could have one beautiful piece of furniture to host family dinners. It was the centerpiece of my childhood, the very heart of the home they had sacrificed everything to leave me. I walked up the driveway, the rain soaking through my silk blouse. Chloe was standing under the covered porch, holding a steaming cup of coffee and pointing a manicured finger at the movers. Brad was right beside her, wearing a waterproof designer jacket, barking orders at a man carrying my late mother's vintage floor lamp. "What is going on here?" I asked, my voice slicing through the sound of the rain. Chloe looked down at me from the porch, a bright, unapologetic smile stretching across her face. "Oh, Maya, you are home early," she chirped, taking a sip of her coffee. "We decided to get a jump start on the move. Marcus told us you were dragging your feet on clearing out the space, so Eleanor hired a crew to help you out." I pointed a shaking finger at the curb. "Why is my dining table sitting in the street?" Chloe rolled her eyes and let out a sharp laugh. "Maya, we are throwing out that trash. It smells like old wood and poverty. Brad bought us a gorgeous imported marble table for the dining room. It fits the aesthetic of the neighborhood so much better. You really should not hold on to junk just because you are sentimental." Brad stepped up next to his wife, crossing his arms. "I told Marcus this would happen. You are entirely too attached to things that have no financial value. We broke the lock because you refused to hand over the spare keys like a rational adult. Consider this an intervention. We are elevating your lifestyle, Maya. You can thank us later when the property value appreciates." Eleanor suddenly appeared in the doorway behind them. She was wearing a pristine cashmere sweater, completely untouched by the weather, holding a clipboard like a battlefield commander. She looked past me, dismissing my soaking wet figure entirely, and yelled at a mover to be careful with her imported velvet chaise lounge. "Eleanor," I said, forcing her to look at me. "You broke into my house." She sighed heavily, stepping out onto the porch. "It is not your house anymore, Maya. It is a family asset. Marcus secured the loan, Brad provided the capital, and we are managing the property. You have your little design studio in the back. That should be more than enough space for you to play make-believe with your fabric swatches. I suggest you go inside and start packing up the kitchen cabinets. My private chef is arriving tomorrow to stock the pantry, and I do not want him dealing with your cheap canned goods." I looked back at the street. The rain was coming down harder now, pooling around the legs of my father's table. I pictured my dad sanding that wood, wiping the sweat from his brow, smiling, as he imagined his daughter sitting around it one day. They had not just invaded my home. They had desecrated my family's memory. They viewed my parents' love as trash to be discarded on the curb. They expected me to snap. They wanted me to scream at them, to throw a tantrum in the rain so they could look at each other and validate their narrative that I was an unstable, hysterical woman who needed to be controlled. They wanted to call Marcus and tell him his wife was having a mental breakdown on the front lawn. I did not give them the satisfaction. I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I wiped the rain from the screen and calmly opened my camera app. I hit record. I slowly panned the camera across the massive moving truck blocking the street. I recorded the shattered front door lock and the splintered wood. I zoomed in on Brad actively directing the movers to carry his furniture inside. I made sure to capture Chloe and Eleanor standing on the porch overseeing the entire operation. "Maya, put that phone away," Brad demanded, stepping toward the edge of the porch, his arrogant smile faltering. "You are acting like a child. Stop recording us." I ignored him. I stopped the recording and opened my encrypted messaging app. I attached the video file and typed a quick, precise message. Breaking and entering in progress at my primary residence. Unauthorized individuals have destroyed the locks. Please dispatch a unit immediately. I did not send the message to a generic emergency dispatcher. I sent it directly to the personal cell phone of the chief of police. He was a close friend of mine, a man who frequently attended Apex Development charity galas, and someone who knew exactly who I was and the magnitude of the empire I controlled. I hit send, slipped the phone back into my pocket, and looked up at Brad. I gave him a cold, empty smile as I stepped out of the rain and under the porch awning. I am not acting like a child, Brad, I said softly. I am acting like a homeowner. I stepped past Brad and Eleanor, ignoring their confused and angry shouts, as the distant wail of police sirens began to echo through the affluent neighborhood. I did not stay on the porch to watch my personal friend, the chief of police, arrive with 3 squad cars to dismantle their illegal moving operation. I did not care to listen to Brad try to explain his way out of breaking and entering. Instead, I walked straight through the chaotic living room, stepped over the splintered wood of my ruined front door, and went directly to the back of the house. I locked myself inside my hidden office and sank into my ergonomic chair. I had a much larger fire to build. I stared at the glowing screens of my dual monitors. The $2 million loan Marcus had secured using my parents' house was the thread I needed to pull. Men like Brad did not just hand out $2 million to their brothers-in-law out of the goodness of their hearts. There was a reason they needed that specific amount of money, and they needed it fast enough to resort to property fraud. I accessed my Apex Development corporate databases, routing my connection through encrypted financial tracking software, usually reserved for vetting massive commercial acquisitions. I bypassed standard banking firewalls and pulled Marcus' entire financial history. I watched the flow of the $2 million. The money did not go to his private equity firm to cover a bad investment or save his career like Brad had claimed. It was routed through a complex series of offshore shell companies, all directly connected to Brad's personal accounts. Why did Brad need $2 million of clean, untraceable cash generated by my husband? I kept digging. I cross-referenced Brad's recent transactions with Chloe's employment history. Chloe worked as a senior executive administrator at St. Jude Medical Center. She always bragged about her prestigious position on the hospital charity board, using it as a prop to elevate her social status. I hacked into the public audit records of the hospital. I bypassed their primitive security measures and accessed the internal accounting ledgers for the pediatric wing. There it was, a massive gaping hole in the hospital's charity fund. The numbers stared back at me in stark, undeniable black and white. Chloe had been systematically siphoning money from the pediatric wing for the last 4 years. She used the stolen funds meant for sick children to buy her designer clothes, her luxury cars, and the lavish lifestyle she endlessly flaunted in my face. Brad had eventually discovered the embezzlement. But instead of turning his wife in, he orchestrated an elaborate cover-up to protect his own reputation. They needed $2 million immediately to replace the missing hospital funds before the annual board audit next week. If the board found the missing money, Chloe would go to federal prison, and Brad's career would be destroyed by the scandal. So they manipulated Marcus. They used his desperate need for their elite approval to convince him to mortgage my parents' house. They promised him a seat at the table. It was not a bridge loan to save Marcus. It was hush money to save Chloe. The next morning, I walked into my kitchen to make breakfast. The police had forced Brad and Eleanor to halt their moving process the night before sending the movers away with citations. However, they were still technically occupying the guest rooms until a judge could formally review the fraudulent property deed. I was standing at the stove frying a simple egg and listening to the rain tap against the window. Chloe strutted into the kitchen wearing a silk robe and perfectly styled hair, looking completely unfazed by the police intervention. She clearly believed Brad's money and influence would easily brush away the legal trouble. She leaned against the marble island holding a designer coffee mug and wrinkled her nose at the smell of my cooking. "Are you really eating that, Maya?" she asked, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. She looked me up and down, treating me like a peasant who had wandered into her castle. Brad and I only eat meals prepared by our private chef now. He makes the most incredible organic egg white omelets. It is amazing how your palate changes when you finally escape the working class. You should really try to elevate your tastes, Maya. Eating like a poor person is just going to keep you trapped in a poverty mindset. You need to learn how to live like us. I flipped my egg onto a plate and turned off the stove. The mention of my parents' humble background, the very parents she was trying to steal from, triggered a fierce internal rage that burned hot in my chest. But my face remained completely impassive. I did not look at her. I simply picked up my plate and walked toward the dining room. But before I left the kitchen, I reached into my tote bag. I pulled out a thick stack of stapled papers and tossed it casually onto the marble counter, right next to Chloe's perfectly manicured hand. "It is funny you mention elevating tastes, Chloe," I said, my voice soft and measured. "I was just reading up on how expensive it is to fund a luxury lifestyle these days, especially when you have to pay for it all by yourself. You might want to take a look." Chloe rolled her eyes, letting out a heavy, dramatic sigh as if I were boring her. She picked up the document with her free hand. I stopped in the hallway and watched her profile. I watched as her eyes scanned the bold black letters printed across the top of the page. It was the complete St. Jude Medical Center preliminary audit report detailing every single fraudulent transaction she had made over the last 4 years. Chloe froze. All the color instantly drained from her face, leaving her looking like a wax doll. Her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated terror. Her perfectly manicured fingers went entirely limp. The designer ceramic coffee mug she was holding slipped from her grasp and crashed against the hardwood floor, shattering into 100 jagged pieces. The sharp crash of ceramic echoing through the kitchen was music to my ears. Chloe stood paralyzed amidst the smoking puddle of organic coffee and shattered porcelain. Her eyes remained glued to the bold font of the audit report. Her jaw trembled as she tried to form words, but her throat produced only a strangled gasp. I did not stop walking. I did not offer her a towel or a sympathetic glance. I simply turned my back on her unraveling reality and continued down the long corridor toward the front of the house. I made it halfway to the foyer when a heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder. I stopped and turned to find Brad blocking my path. He was dressed in a tailored navy suit smelling faintly of expensive cologne and misplaced arrogance. He glanced over his shoulder toward the kitchen, hearing the faint sounds of Chloe frantically scrambling on the floor to gather the printed pages, but he dismissed the noise entirely. He assumed his wife was simply having a clumsy morning. He had no idea the empire he built on stolen charity funds was actively burning to the ground. "Maya, we need to talk," Brad said, his voice adopting a low, patronizing tone. He gestured toward my father's study, steering me inside and shutting the heavy oak doors behind us. He leaned against the mahogany desk, crossing his arms, and looking at me with an expression of performative pity. I stood my ground, keeping my posture straight, and my hands casually tucked into the pockets of my tailored trousers. "What is there to talk about, Brad?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly flat. "You broke my front door. You tried to throw my family heirlooms into the street. The police told you to halt your illegal eviction. I think our lines of communication are quite clear." Brad let out a deep theatrical sigh and pinched the bridge of his nose. He was playing the weary savior forced to deal with an unreasonable child. "Look, Maya, I understand you are emotional. Marcus has made a complete mess of your life. He is a financial disaster and he dragged you down with him when he leveraged this house. But you have to face reality. You cannot afford a protracted legal battle against my firm. We have infinite capital. We will tie you up in litigation until you are bankrupt and living in your car." He pushed away from the desk and walked slowly toward me, closing the distance until he was invading my personal space. "I am not a monster, Maya," he continued, his voice softening into a sickeningly benevolent purr. "I actually feel bad for you. You married a weak man and now you are paying the price. I want to offer you a way out, a clean break." He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a crisp white envelope. He tapped it against his palm. "Inside here is a cashier's check for $20,000, tax-free cash. It is yours right now. All you have to do is sign a quitclaim deed officially surrendering your remaining rights to the property, and agree to walk away without a messy divorce battle dragging Marcus into court. I stared at the envelope. $20,000. He was trying to buy a house worth over $800,000 for the price of a used sedan. He was trying to bribe me into covering up a $2 million fraudulent mortgage by throwing pocket change in my face. Brad noticed my silence and mistook my calculated restraint for hesitation. He smiled a predatory grin that crinkled the corners of his eyes. Think about it, Maya. $20,000 is a lot of money for a woman in your position. It is a fresh start. You can start a nice little hair salon in the inner city with this. That is more your speed anyway. You were never truly cut out for this neighborhood or this caliber of wealth. Take the money. Go back to where you belong and let the professionals handle the real wealth. I looked at the envelope and then slowly raised my eyes to meet his. He stood there brimming with unearned confidence, fully believing he had just outsmarted a naive housewife. He believed his vast wealth made him untouchable. He believed my working-class background made me stupid. Are you offering me $20,000 to validate a fraudulent mortgage? I asked, my voice quiet and deliberate. Brad chuckled, shaking his head. Do not use words like fraudulent, Maya. It makes you sound bitter. Marcus signed the paperwork. My firm provided the capital. The house is collateral. I am simply offering you a generous settlement to avoid the embarrassment of a public foreclosure. You sign the deed, I hand you the check, and we all move on with our lives. It is a perfectly legal transaction. I held his gaze for a long, terrible moment. The rain continued to beat against the study windows, mirroring the relentless ticking of the clock he did not even know was counting down. He thrust the envelope slightly forward, urging me to take it. Instead of reaching for the money, I slid my right hand out of my trouser pocket. My fingers were wrapped around a sleek, black digital voice recorder. The tiny red light on the top was blinking in a steady, rhythmic pulse. I held the device up right between us so Brad could see the digital timer actively ticking away the seconds of his confession. His smug smile instantly vanished, replaced by a hard, rigid line of realization. The color drained from his face, matching the exact shade of panic his wife was currently wearing in the kitchen. Thank you, Brad, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. I just needed you to explicitly state on tape that you are trying to extort a property owner using forged collateral. Brad stood entirely frozen in the center of the study. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a polished wax figure. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The tiny red light on my digital recorder blinked methodically, marking the silence. I did not wait for him to recover his wits or attempt another pathetic bribe. I turned on my heel and walked out of the room, leaving him trapped in the suffocating reality of his own making. I needed to find my husband. The hallway was quiet now. The movers had vanished. I could hear the faint sound of police sirens fading into the distance down the street. As I reached the main foyer, the shattered front door was forcefully shoved open. A gust of freezing rain and wind swept into the house, followed immediately by Marcus. His expensive designer suit was completely soaked. His silk tie was pulled loose and his hair was plastered to his forehead. He looked wild. The carefully constructed corporate facade he wore like a shield had completely dissolved. He shoved the broken door shut against the wind and turned to face me. His chest heaved with heavy, erratic breaths. He locked eyes with me, and his expression morphed from blind panic into absolute fury. Maya, he snarled, lunging forward. He grabbed my upper arm. His fingers dug painfully into my skin as he forcefully dragged me toward the staircase. Let go of me, Marcus, I demanded, planting my feet on the hardwood floor. He ignored me. He yanked me up the wooden steps, practically dragging me down the second-floor hallway until we reached the master bedroom. He shoved me inside, followed me in, and slammed the heavy oak door. I heard the loud metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place. He released my arm and marched over to his leather briefcase resting on the bed. His hands shook violently as he unclasped the brass buckles. He rummaged through the disorganized papers and pulled out a damp, crumpled document. A bright yellow sticky note pointed to a blank signature line at the very bottom of the page. He grabbed a heavy gold pen from his nightstand and thrust both the pen and the paper against my chest. "Sign it," he ordered, his voice a harsh, frantic bark. "Sign it right now, Maya." I looked down at the document. It was a retroactive authorization form, a legal addendum specifically designed to validate the initial $2 million loan using the house as collateral. It was his desperate attempt to clean up the crime scene after the police showed up on our front lawn. He needed my signature to retroactively make the fraud disappear. I let the paper flutter to the floor and dropped the gold pen onto the carpet. "I will not sign anything, Marcus," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm and steady. Marcus snapped. He kicked the gold pen across the room and lunged at me. He backed me up against the locked bedroom door, slamming both of his hands flat against the wood on either side of my head. He leaned in so close I could feel the frantic heat radiating off his skin. He was physically trapping me, his towering frame blocking any chance of escape. The veins in his neck bulged against his wet collar. "You do not have a choice, Maya," he yelled, his voice vibrating with rage. "The police were just outside our house. Brad is threatening to destroy my entire career. You are going to sign that paper right now, or we are both going to lose absolutely everything." I stared directly into his panicked eyes, refusing to shrink away from his aggression. "You already lost everything, Marcus," I replied, my tone completely devoid of fear. "I know about the $2 million. I know you funneled it to Brad to cover up Chloe's embezzlement at the hospital. And I know you forged my signature on the original deed to get the money in the first place." For a split second, Marcus looked stunned. Then his expression twisted into something ugly and cruel. He dropped his hands from the door and let out a harsh, mocking laugh. The panic in his eyes was instantly replaced by a deep, chilling arrogance. "Of course I forged your name," he spat out, crossing his arms over his wetsuit. "Do you honestly think I was going to let you ruin my one chance to secure my position in Brad's inner circle? I needed that capital, and your name on that deed was the only way to get it." He took a step closer, looking me up and down with absolute disdain. "Do you want to know the real reason I married you, Maya? It was not for your charming personality or your pathetic little design hobbies. I married you because you were weak. Your parents had just died. You were completely alone in the world with no money and no backbone. You were desperate for affection and so incredibly easy to control. I thought I was getting a quiet, obedient little wife who would sit in the background, ask no questions, and let me run the show." He smirked, shaking his head as if my defiance was a hilarious joke. "And who do you think is going to believe you anyway?" he sneered. "You are a low-class nobody who plays with fabric swatches. I am a respected chief financial officer. I manage millions of dollars for elite clients. If you try to take this to the authorities, I will bury you. I will tell the judge you are a hysterical, grieving woman who signed the papers and simply forgot. They will look at my tailored suit, my corporate title, and my bank accounts, and they will laugh you right out of the building." I let him finish. I let him lay out his entire arrogant, misogynistic criminal mindset in perfect clarity. I did not scream or argue. Instead, I calmly reached into the front pocket of my trousers. I pulled out my phone, keeping the screen facing him. The active video call interface illuminated his smug face. The red recording indicator pulsed steadily in the corner of the screen. "Thank you, Marcus," I said, my voice chillingly calm. "The live stream to my legal team is still running, honey." Marcus froze. The color drained from his face so rapidly he looked like a corpse. His eyes darted from the red recording indicator on my phone screen to my unwavering gaze. The arrogant sneer melted off his lips, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of absolute terror. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His hands, which had been braced aggressively against the door beside my head, slowly slid down the polished wood. I tapped the screen once, ending the stream and saving the encrypted file directly to my offshore secure server. My lead corporate attorney already had the footage. It was entirely out of Marcus' hands now. "You should really learn to control your temper, Marcus," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "It is going to look terrible in front of the judge when they play this back at our divorce hearing, and at your fraud trial." He stumbled backward, his wet shoes squeaking awkwardly against the hardwood floor. He bumped into the edge of the bed and collapsed onto the mattress, putting his head between his hands. The immaculate, untouchable chief financial officer had been reduced to a shivering, pathetic mess in less than 60 seconds. He did not try to stop me as I reached out, unlocked the deadbolt, and walked out of the master bedroom. I pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me, leaving him completely alone in his self-made ruin. Over the next 2 days, the atmosphere inside my house transformed into a bizarre psychological Cold War. Marcus became a ghost. He barricaded himself in the guest room, drinking heavily and avoiding eye contact with everyone. Brad was equally absent, spending hours pacing the backyard while screaming into his cell phone. My legal team had officially initiated the hostile takeover of Brad's private equity firm, freezing his corporate accounts. Between that and the hospital audit report, I had dropped in Chloe's lap. The two of them were actively watching their elite empire burn to the ground. Chloe refused to leave her bedroom, altogether terrified that the police were going to show up at any moment to arrest her for embezzlement. Yet amidst this catastrophic collapse, Eleanor remained blissfully entirely ignorant. Marcus was too ashamed to admit he had been outsmarted by his own wife. Brad was too egotistical to confess his impending financial ruin to his mother-in-law. Because the men kept their mouths shut to protect their fragile pride, Eleanor continued to float through my home like a victorious monarch. She honestly believed the battle was already won. She thought my refusal to scream and fight was a sign of submission. She mistook my calm, calculated silence for defeat. On Thursday afternoon, I was sitting at the kitchen island reviewing a digital contract from my attorney. The heavy scent of expensive floral perfume announced Eleanor's arrival before she even walked into the room. She glided into the kitchen, wearing a pristine pearl-colored suit, holding a massive stack of thick cream-colored envelopes. She dropped them onto the marble counter right next to my laptop with a heavy, authoritative thud. I looked at the top envelope. The return address read, "The Jenkins Family Estate," followed by my home address. The calligraphy was embossed in real gold foil. "I hope you are planning to make yourself useful this weekend, Maya," Eleanor announced, crossing her arms and looking down her nose at me. "I have officially mailed out 200 invitations for our housewarming and blessing ceremony this Sunday. The entire elite congregation from St. Jude's Cathedral will be attending. The senior pastor is coming to personally bless the property and officially welcome us to the neighborhood." I stared at the stack of invitations. She had invited 200 of the wealthiest, most influential people in Georgia to celebrate stealing my childhood home. She was planning to use my parents' house as a social prop to elevate her standing in her pretentious church community. Brad has hired a 5-star catering company to handle the hors d'oeuvres and the champagne service. She continued pacing in front of the counter. "The floral arrangements are arriving tomorrow morning. I want this house completely spotless by Saturday night. I expect you to clear out your little design studio in the back before the guests arrive. We are converting that space into a coat room for the evening." I slowly closed my laptop and looked up at her. "And what exactly is my role in this grand celebration?" Eleanor asked, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. She offered a thin, condescending smile. She reached into her designer tote bag and pulled out a folded piece of white fabric. She tossed it onto the counter. It slid across the marble and stopped inches from my hands. It was a crisp, white catering apron. "Your role is to stay completely out of the way," she stated, her voice hardening with absolute malice. "You can either stay locked in your bedroom, or you can put that apron on and help the catering staff pass out the champagne flutes. I think the latter is far more appropriate, do you not agree?" I looked down at the white cotton fabric. My chest tightened. "It is exactly what your mother used to wear," Eleanor sneered, leaning closer so I could smell the mint on her breath. "I remember hiring her catering company decades ago for my summer garden parties. Your mother was always so good at blending into the background. She knew how to keep her head down and serve the food while her betters enjoyed the evening. She understood her place in the world, Maya. It is about time you learned yours. You come from the serving class. Do not ever forget that. Put the apron on Sunday, or do not come downstairs at all." She turned on her heel and marched out of the kitchen, entirely satisfied with her cruel little speech. She thought she had delivered the ultimate insult by mocking the woman who had scrubbed floors and worked midnight catering shifts just to build the very house Eleanor was currently standing in. I reached out and picked up the white apron. The cotton felt coarse against my fingers. I thought about my mother's calloused hands. I thought about the sweat on her brow. I thought about the sheer unyielding strength it took for her to survive in a world full of vultures like Eleanor Jenkins. The rage inside me did not boil over. It froze solid, turning into a weapon of absolute precision. I looked toward the empty hallway, where Eleanor had just disappeared. I held the apron tightly in my grip and let a hollow, terrifying smile stretch across my face. "I will gladly wear it," I whispered to the empty room. "I will make sure it is an event this church will never forget." I folded the crisp, white catering apron with meticulous care, smoothing out the harsh creases before resting it gently on the kitchen island. The coarse cotton felt heavy beneath my fingertips, weighted with the bitter memories of my mother's sacrifices. I was no longer the frightened little girl who sat silently in the shadows watching her mother scrub floors and serve champagne to women like Eleanor Jenkins. I had evolved. I was the architect of their impending ruin, and they were blindly walking right into the center of my trap. The peace of my silent preparation was shattered early the next morning. A violent, relentless pounding echoed through the grand foyer, shaking the glass panes of the front windows. It was not the polite knock of a delivery courier or the hesitant tap of a visiting neighbor. It was the aggressive, authoritative hammering of someone demanding immediate, absolute submission. I walked slowly down the long corridor, my bare feet silent against the polished hardwood. When I pulled open the heavy oak door, the crisp morning air swept in, carrying the distinct, unmistakable stench of desperation. Brad stood squarely on my front porch. He had traded his tailored navy business suit for a sharp slate gray ensemble, exuding a predatory, calculated confidence. Beside him stood a massive, broad-shouldered man wearing the uniform of a local sheriff's deputy. The deputy's thick hand rested casually on his dark utility belt, his entire posture designed specifically to intimidate and overwhelm. "Good morning, Maya," Brad announced, his voice dripping with venomous condescension. "I am truly sorry to interrupt your weekend preparations, but we have some official business to conclude today." The deputy stepped aggressively forward, thrusting a thick stack of stapled legal papers directly toward my chest. "Maya Jenkins, you are hereby served with a formal notice of summary ejectment and an immediate writ of possession. You have exactly 1 hour to vacate these premises." I did not flinch. I did not reach out to take the intimidating stack of papers. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my hands resting casually in the pockets of my silk robe. 1 hour, I asked, raising a single skeptical brow. "That seems rather expedited for a standard residential eviction proceeding." Brad smirked, stepping closer and completely ignoring my question. He launched into a rapid-fire monologue of dense, suffocating legal jargon. "The property is currently in default under the accelerated collateral clauses of the commercial loan agreement Maya. Due to the unlawful detainer statutes and the immediate transfer of title to my private equity firm, you have officially forfeited all tenancy rights. My firm holds the principal deed in escrow, meaning you are now classified by the state as a hostile squatter. If you do not leave this property willingly, Deputy Miller here is fully authorized to physically remove you and your personal belongings to the curb." I listened to his practiced, rhythmic speech, feeling a cold wave of utter disgust wash over me. I recognized this exact tactic. It was the signature weapon of his predatory private equity firm. Brad specialized in aggressively acquiring properties in working-class and minority neighborhoods. He would show up on the doorsteps of families who had lived in their generational homes for decades, armed with corrupt local officials. He had quietly paid off and a barrage of confusing, terrifying legal terminology. He used intimidation and complex jargon to steamroll people who did not have the immediate financial resources to fight back, forcing them out before they even understood what was happening to their lives. He expected me to crumble and cry, just like the hundreds of vulnerable families he had ruthlessly displaced. "You really think you can bulldoze me with a few big words, Brad?" I asked, keeping my gaze locked entirely on his smug face. "You think you can fast-track an illegal eviction on a Saturday morning just to ensure I am not here to ruin Eleanor's precious little housewarming party tomorrow?" Brad's arrogant smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, revealing the genuine frantic panic lurking beneath his polished exterior. He knew I possessed the audio recording of Marcus confessing to the $2 million fraud. He knew his elite corporate empire was incredibly vulnerable. He was trying to physically remove me from the board before I could detonate the explosive evidence in front of his wealthy peers. "This has absolutely nothing to do with Eleanor," he snapped, his tone growing harsh and breathless. "This is basic property law. You do not own this house anymore, Maya. My firm does. Now, are you going to pack a bag, or is Deputy Miller going to have to drag you out of here by your hair?" The deputy puffed out his chest, trying to look appropriately menacing. "Mom, I strongly advise you to comply right now. Mr. Jenkins has the legal deed right here in his hand. The judge signed the emergency order this morning. You are entirely out of options." I finally reached out and plucked the thick eviction notice from the deputy's thick fingers. I slowly flipped past the intimidating cover sheet, scanning the bold black text on the second page. The eviction order was filed against Marcus Jenkins and Maya Jenkins, listed specifically as individual private residents. I let out a soft, genuinely amused laugh. "Is something funny?" Brad demanded, his face flushing a deep, angry red. I looked up, meeting the deputy's eyes instead of Brad's. "Tell me, Deputy Miller, what are the exact legal penalties for executing a fraudulent eviction notice on behalf of a private corporation? Is it an immediate unpaid suspension, or do you lose your state pension entirely when the board permanently revokes your badge?" The deputy's aggressive face stiffened. "I do not know what you are talking about, lady. I have a signed order from a superior court judge." "You have a signed order based entirely on falsified property records." I corrected, my voice slicing through the morning air with absolute, unyielding authority. I turned my back on them and walked over to the vintage console table in the foyer. I opened the top drawer and pulled out a thick, heavy envelope sealed with the official gold crest of the state Supreme Court. I walked back to the open doorway and handed the envelope directly to the deputy, bypassing Brad entirely. "I highly suggest you read that very carefully, Deputy, before you make a career-ending mistake for a man who will happily let you take the fall." Brad tried to snatch the envelope, but the deputy pulled it back, ripping the heavy gold seal open. He unfolded the thick parchment paper, and his eyes rapidly scanned the dense legal text. As he read, the blood rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly. His imposing posture completely collapsed, and he took a sudden, noticeable step backward, putting distance between himself and Brad. "What is it?" Brad demanded, leaning over, trying to read the document. "What fake garbage did she give you?" The deputy swallowed hard, looking at me with a mixture of profound shock and sheer escalating panic. "This is a certified corporate charter from the state Supreme Court," he stammered, his voice shaking. "The property at this address is not owned by Marcus and Maya Jenkins as individuals." "What are you talking about?" Brad yelled, snatching the heavy paper from the deputy's trembling hands. "Of course it is. I have the deed. Marcus signed the house over to my firm." "Look at the date of transfer, Brad," I said, leaning comfortably against the wooden doorframe. "I transferred the total ownership of this entire estate to a private holding company 6 months ago. The house is officially owned by Apex Holdings, LLC. I am not a private resident. I am the sole corporate proprietor of the commercial entity that owns the ground you are currently trespassing on." Brad's eyes darted frantically across the gold-sealed document. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but he could not form a single coherent word. He realized instantly what this meant. The $2 million mortgage Marcus had forged and leveraged through Brad's firm was entirely useless. Marcus had pledged an asset he legally did not own as an individual. The collateral was completely void. Furthermore, I continued, my voice ringing with cold, clinical precision, an eviction notice filed against individual residential tenants cannot be legally enforced against a corporate entity holding a separate commercial deed. Your emergency eviction order is completely invalid. It is effectively expensive toilet paper. The deputy was already backing down the porch steps, putting as much distance between himself and Brad as physically possible. "Mr. Jenkins," he stammered, holding his hands up defensively, "I cannot execute this order. If I try to force her out, knowing she holds a certified corporate deed, I will be slapped with a massive federal civil rights lawsuit. You told me this was a standard domestic default. You lied to my captain. Deputy, wait! Brad pleaded, his polished, flawless facade completely shattering into a million desperate pieces. We can fix this. I have the paperwork from the bank. I can explain. I am out of here, the deputy said, shaking his head rapidly. I am not getting dragged into a federal corporate fraud investigation for a quick payout. He turned and practically sprinted toward his parked patrol car, eager to escape the radioactive blast zone of Brad's monumental criminal negligence. Brad stood completely alone on my front porch, holding his useless eviction notice in one hand and my impenetrable corporate charter in the other. His hands shook violently. The realization of his complete and utter defeat washed over him, leaving him stuttering and gasping for air, staring at me as his entire stolen empire began to crumble beneath his expensive leather shoes. Brad stared at the gold seal on the corporate charter as if it were a venomous snake about to strike. He slowly lowered his trembling hands. The crisp morning wind caught the edges of the invalid eviction notice, tearing it right out of his loose grip. He did not even try to catch it. He turned his back on me. His shoulders slumped in absolute agonizing defeat and walked heavily down the driveway. He climbed into his luxury sedan and sped away, leaving his fabricated legal threat blowing across my front lawn. I walked down the steps, retrieved the discarded paper, ripped it into tiny shreds, and tossed it into the recycling bin. I had a party to prepare for. By Sunday evening, my childhood home had been completely hijacked. The quiet residential street was choked with European sports cars and stretched luxury sedans. Valet attendants in crisp white shirts scrambled up and down the driveway, rushing to open doors for the arriving guests. Inside the house, the transformation was sickening. Eleanor had hired a fleet of decorators who suffocated every flat surface with towering arrangements of white lilies and orchids. The heavy scent of the flowers mixed with expensive perfumes, creating an atmosphere that felt less like a home and more like a high-end mausoleum. A string quartet played softly in the corner of the grand living room, while uniformed waitstaff navigated the crowded floor, balancing silver trays of champagne flutes and delicate hors d'oeuvres. Eleanor had successfully gathered the absolute highest echelon of Atlanta society. The room was packed with elite members of St. Jude's Cathedral, including the senior pastor, wealthy politicians, and local real estate magnates. Eleanor stood at the absolute epicenter of the room, holding court like a victorious monarch. She wore a stunning diamond necklace that caught the light of the chandelier with every slight movement of her head. She was beaming, radiating a fake pious grace as she dramatically recounted her exhausting efforts to bring a sense of refined elegance to this neighborhood. The senior pastor and his wife nodded along, hanging on her every word, offering their enthusiastic blessings for her new property. Eleanor was in her element, completely oblivious to the fact that her husband and her son-in-law were currently sitting on a federal powder keg. I knew exactly where the men were hiding. Through the cracked doors of my father's study, a thick cloud of heavy cigar smoke drifted into the hallway. Marcus and Brad had sequestered themselves away from the religious elite, pouring expensive scotch and trying desperately to drink their way out of their impending ruin. They had not spoken a single word to Eleanor. They lacked the courage to tell her that the house she was currently showing off belonged to an LLC she could never legally touch. They were simply running out the clock, hiding in the dark and praying for a miracle that would never arrive. I stood in the shadows of the second-floor landing, looking down at the milling crowd below. I remained completely out of sight, but I could perfectly hear the sharp, venomous whispers of the church wives drifting up the sweeping staircase. They held their champagne flutes, delicately masking their cruel gossip behind polite smiles. I feel simply dreadful for poor Marcus, a woman in a tailored Chanel suit murmured, leaning close to a church elder. Eleanor told me he has the patience of an absolute saint, putting up with that ghetto wife of his. The church elder shook his head, offering a sympathetic sigh. It is a tragedy, truly. Eleanor says the girl refuses to embrace the Lord's blessings. She is probably hiding in her room right now out of sheer embarrassment because she simply does not know how to behave in polite society. I did not let their manufactured gossip sting. I did not feel an ounce of shame. I simply turned away from the wooden railing and walked back into my master bedroom. The white catering apron Eleanor had tossed at me yesterday lay discarded on the floor exactly where I had kicked it. I stepped right over the coarse cotton fabric and walked directly into my expansive walk-in closet. I bypassed the modest conservative clothing my mother-in-law had previously deemed acceptable for a woman of my background. Instead, I reached for the heavy protective garment bag I had securely hidden at the very back of the rack. When I emerged from the bedroom, I was not wearing a catering apron. I was wearing a breathtaking custom-tailored emerald silk gown. The rich jewel-tone fabric clung perfectly to my curves before flowing gracefully to the floor in a dramatic sweep. The cut was bold, entirely unapologetic, and radiated absolute power. I paired the gown with my mother's vintage gold drop earrings and applied a sharp, bold crimson lip. I did not look like a grieving, submissive housewife. I looked exactly like the wealthy, powerful corporate owner I actually was. I walked to the edge of the grand staircase. The massive crystal chandelier suspended above the foyer cast a brilliant, illuminating glow directly onto the top step. I stepped firmly into the light. The vibrant emerald silk caught the reflection, immediately drawing the eye of a passing waiter, who stopped dead in his tracks and gasped softly. That single sharp intake of breath caused a ripple effect across the crowded floor. One by one, the elite church members stopped talking and looked up toward the landing. The string quartet faltered, losing their rhythm as the musicians stared. The condescending whispers instantly died in their throats. The room fell into a sudden, heavy silence. Eleanor turned around, annoyed by the sudden quiet. When she looked up at the staircase, her smug smile vanished. Her expensive diamond necklace suddenly looked incredibly cheap compared to the sheer commanding presence I radiated from the top of the stairs. I glided down the wooden steps, my heels clicking rhythmically, echoing clearly through the silent house. I reached the bottom landing and smoothly plucked a crystal champagne flute from the tray of the frozen waiter. I grabbed a heavy silver spoon from the table beside him. I looked directly at Eleanor, holding her horrified, wide-eyed gaze. I raised the silver spoon and tapped the crystal glass. The sharp, clear, ringing sound cut through the suffocating tension, commanding the absolute, undivided attention of the entire room. The sharp chime of the crystal echoed again and again. It cut through the suffocating tension with the precision of a scalpel. The final murmurs of the Atlanta elite faded into absolute silence. The string quartet lowered their bows in confusion. The catering staff froze perfectly still like marble statues holding their silver trays of champagne. I lowered the silver spoon and let my gaze sweep across the sea of designer gowns and tailored suits. These were the people who judged others on their zip codes and bank balances. They were the very people Eleanor worshipped. Beside the grand marble fireplace stood a sleek silver microphone resting on a modest acrylic podium. Eleanor had carefully placed it there for her upcoming self-congratulatory speech. I walked toward it. My emerald gown parted the crowd like the Red Sea. The wealthy guests stepped back instinctively, making a wide path for me, unable to look away from the sheer authority radiating from my posture. I reached the podium and wrapped my fingers firmly around the cool metal of the microphone. I lifted it from the stand. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice echoing crisp and clear through the mansion's built-in surround sound system. "Thank you all so much for coming out tonight to bless my home." The color violently rushed back into Eleanor's face. The shock that had momentarily paralyzed her evaporated instantly. It was replaced by sheer, unadulterated rage. She realized exactly what I was doing. I was claiming ownership in front of the very people she was trying to impress. She marched across the Persian rug, her heels sinking heavily into the expensive wool. "What are you doing?" she hissed, her voice barely contained as she closed the distance between us. "Put that down right now and get back upstairs to your room." I ignored her entirely, keeping my focus on the bewildered audience. "I know Eleanor has been telling you all wonderful, inspiring stories about the Jenkins family legacy." I continued speaking smoothly into the microphone. Eleanor lunged. Her manicured hand clawed through the air, aiming directly for the microphone. I anticipated the desperate movement. I shifted my weight, gracefully pivoting on my heel and stepping smoothly to the side. Eleanor's momentum carried her forward. She stumbled awkwardly, her heavy diamond necklace swinging wildly as she barely caught herself on the edge of the acrylic podium. "You insolent little trash," she whispered venomously, leaning in close so the guests could not hear her vile tone. "I will ruin you for this. Give me the microphone." "Give." I simply took another step back, keeping the device securely in my grip. Before Eleanor could attempt another physical assault, a heavy, broad-shouldered figure pushed aggressively through the crowd of stunned church elders. Brad emerged from the hallway. He had abandoned his scotch and his hiding place in the study. His face was flushed red with panic, but he immediately slipped into his practiced corporate persona. He stepped firmly in front of Eleanor, shielding her from me. He turned to the crowd and projected his booming, authoritative voice over the room. He used the exact same intimidating vocal tactics he employed when bullying low-income families out of their homes. "Please forgive the interruption, everyone," Brad announced, waving his hands in a placating, dismissive gesture. "I deeply apologize for this unfortunate scene. My sister-in-law Maya is suffering from a severe mental episode. The stress of recent events has caused a hysterical break from reality. We are getting her the medical help she desperately needs." The crowd murmured nervously. Several church wives actually clutched their pearls, exchanging pitying, condescending glances. Brad reached out, trying to grab my arm to physically drag me away from the podium. "Come along, Maya," he said, his tone dripping with fake patronizing concern. "Let us get you upstairs before you embarrass yourself further." I effortlessly sidestepped his aggressive grasp. I brought the microphone back to my lips. "A mental episode, Brad?" I asked, my voice echoing loudly and cutting cleanly through his booming baritone. "Is that the exact legal term your firm uses when you displace families from their neighborhoods?" Brad froze, his hands suspended in midair. "And Eleanor?" I continued, turning my gaze back to the matriarch, who was shaking with fury. "Hysterical! That is a very specific and calculated word choice. It is incredibly funny how history repeats itself in this family." I looked out at the senior pastor, who was watching the exchange with wide, alarmed eyes. "You see, 5 years ago, I stood in a freezing funeral parlor, looking at the closed caskets of my parents. I was 20 years old, completely alone, and my entire world had just been violently shattered. I was weeping over their bodies. And do you know what Eleanor Jenkins told the funeral director while she was helping Marcus plan the arrangements?" The room was dead silent. Even Brad seemed incapable of moving under the weight of the collective stare of the congregation. "She told him to ignore my hysteria." I said, my voice dropping to a cold, hard frequency that demanded absolute attention. "She told him my grief was just a low-class theatrical display, and that I was emotionally unstable. That has always been your favorite weapon, Eleanor. Whenever someone exposes your cruelty or your crimes, you simply label them crazy to discredit their voice." Eleanor's mouth opened and closed. She looked around at her elite friends, desperately searching for a sympathetic face, but the crowd was thoroughly captivated by the train wreck unfolding before them. At that exact moment, Marcus finally stumbled out of the study corridor. He looked completely unhinged. His expensive suit was still damp and wrinkled from his frantic run in the rain. He saw me holding the microphone and let out a strangled, panicked noise. He knew exactly what was coming next. He scrambled toward the wall, desperately searching for the main lighting panel to cut the power to the room. "You want to talk about reality, Brad?" I asked, ignoring Marcus entirely. "You want to talk about the reality of how this elite family affords its endless miracles and generous church donations. Let us look at the actual numbers." I turned my attention to the massive 85-inch smart television mounted securely above the grand marble fireplace. It had been playing a continuous silent slideshow of Eleanor's curated family portraits all evening. I raised my free hand and sharply snapped my fingers. Instantly, the fake smiling portraits vanished. The massive screen flickered black for a fraction of a second before illuminating the entire living room with a bright, blinding white light. I had synced my phone to the central display network hours ago. Displayed in glowing, pristine 4K resolution were the unredacted, highly confidential bank statements belonging to Marcus and Chloe. Every single illegal transfer, every embezzled hospital charity fund, and every fraudulent wire movement routed directly into Brad's offshore shell companies was highlighted in bright, unmistakable neon yellow for the entire congregation to read. The glowing 4K screen bathed the grand living room in a harsh, unforgiving light, completely overpowering the warm, ambient glow of the crystal chandeliers. Gasps rippled through the tightly packed crowd of Atlanta elite. I watched the senior pastor of St. Jude's Cathedral physically recoil. His eyes darted rapidly across the highlighted rows of offshore routing numbers, matching them to the exact dates of the church's annual charity drives. He was looking at his own stolen parish funds neatly embezzled by his most trusted financial advisor. If you look closely at the third column, I announced, my voice projecting smoothly through the microphone, you will see the exact trajectory of the $2 million commercial loan Marcus Jenkins fraudulently leveraged against this very estate. He used my childhood home as collateral for a massive illicit cash injection to cover his catastrophic personal debts. Marcus let out a guttural sound of pure panic. He shoved past a cluster of horrified church wives, nearly knocking an elderly woman in a silk gown to the floor. He scrambled wildly toward the massive television screen. His wet shoes slipped on the polished marble, but he caught himself clawing desperately at the sleek bezel of the monitor. He reached behind the ultra-thin screen, pulling frantically at the thick cluster of HDMI and power cables. He yanked them with all his strength, trying to literally tear the wiring from the drywall to stop his public execution. Nothing happened. The screen remained brilliantly illuminated, freezing his financial crimes in high definition for everyone to see. "Save your strength, Marcus," I said, my tone echoing with cold, clinical amusement. The display network is hardwired directly into the central smart home server. I locked the administrator access protocols from my phone an hour ago. You cannot turn it off. He spun around, pressing his back against the wall beneath the screen. He looked absolutely feral. His tailored suit was askew, his hair plastered to his sweating forehead. "Maya, please," he begged, his voice cracking as he looked out at the sea of judging faces. "You are taking this completely out of context. I can explain the accounting errors. It was just a temporary reallocation of corporate assets." "A temporary reallocation?" I repeated, letting the microphone amplify my skeptical laugh. "Let us see what you called it in private." I tapped the screen of my phone, instantly syncing an encrypted audio file to the house's surround sound speakers. The pristine string quartet music had long since faded, replaced now by the undeniable sound of Marcus sobbing. His own panicked voice filled the grand living room, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings. "I had no choice, Brad." The recorded voice of Marcus pleaded, echoing from every corner of the estate. "I was completely underwater. The house was the only asset with enough equity to cover the spread. I forged Maya's signature on the commercial deed. I paid a notary to backdate the stamp. If she finds out, I'm going to federal prison." The collective gasp from the congregation sucked the remaining oxygen right out of the room. The church wives, who had been whispering cruel insults about me just moments ago, now stared at Marcus with absolute profound disgust. Eleanor stood frozen by the acrylic podium. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking like a wax statue. Her perfect, immaculate son, the pristine chief financial officer, had just confessed to a major federal felony over the living room speakers. "You see," I continued, pacing slowly across the top of the marble stairs, "I have spent the last 5 years listening to this congregation praise Marcus Jenkins. You called him a pillar of the community. You praised his unyielding dedication to family values. You whispered about how incredibly patient he was for putting up with a wife who clearly did not belong in your elevated social circles." I pointed directly at the sweating, trembling man pinned against the wall. "Let me tell you exactly how this devoted family man spent $2 million of stolen money. It did not go into a bad real estate investment. It did not go into a volatile stock portfolio. He blew $600,000 at high-stakes underground baccarat tables in Macau, trying desperately to chase his mounting losses. Marcus squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head rapidly. "Stop," he whimpered, his hands covering his ears. "And the rest," I continued, my voice rising with unyielding authority. "The rest went to a luxury penthouse lease in Buckhead and a steady stream of designer handbags for a 24-year-old cocktail waitress named Chloe. That is where your generous church donations went, Pastor. That is where the hospital pediatric charity funds went. Marcus Jenkins used your faith and your money to fund a double life, while his mother demanded I wear an apron and serve you champagne like a hired maid." The sheer absolute destruction of his flawless facade finally broke him. The pristine Christian husband narrative was pulverized into dust, and he knew he would never recover his standing in Atlanta society again. His reputation was dead. His freedom was about to be taken by federal investigators. He had nothing left to lose. "You ruined my life," Marcus screamed, his voice tearing fiercely through his throat. His eyes rolled back with a sudden explosive rage. He pushed off the marble wall and charged. He abandoned the television, bypassing the horrified pastor, and sprinted directly toward the bottom of the staircase. His hands were curled into tight fists, his face contorted into a mask of pure, violent desperation. He lunged forward, preparing to grab me and drag me down the steps. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I did not even lower the microphone. Before Marcus could place a single foot on the bottom stair, the heavy mahogany doors of the formal dining room burst open. Two massive, broad-shouldered men wearing immaculate black suits and tactical earpieces stepped fluidly out of the shadows. They moved with terrifying, coordinated speed. The first private security guard hit Marcus at a full sprint, driving a heavy shoulder directly into his rib cage. Marcus let out a sharp, breathless wheeze as the impact lifted him completely off his feet. The second guard grabbed Marcus by the back of his expensive suit jacket and slammed him face down onto the solid marble floor. The sickening thud of the impact echoed sharply through the room, ending his pathetic attack instantly. Marcus groaned a low, pathetic sound as his cheek pressed flat against the cold marble. The two massive private security guards locked his arms securely behind his back, pressing their heavy knees between his shoulder blades. The absolute finality of his physical capture broke the spell that had frozen the room. Pandemonium erupted instantly. The church congregation scrambled backward, abandoning their polite society manners. They pushed against each other, treating my family members like they carried a highly contagious disease. The wealthy real estate magnates and pious church elders whispered furiously, their faces pale with profound shock. Eleanor stood completely paralyzed near the acrylic podium. Her hands gripped the edges of the clear stand so tightly her knuckles were stark white. The matriarch, who had dedicated her entire life to projecting an image of pious, flawless superiority, was now forced to watch her golden children be exposed as ruthless criminals in front of her most coveted social circle. She could not speak. She could not move. She was trapped in a public nightmare entirely of her own making. From the center of the terrified, chaotic crowd, a high-pitched, shrill voice pierced the heavy atmosphere. "You are a liar, Maya." Chloe pushed her way aggressively to the front of the grand foyer, shoving a prominent city councilwoman out of her path. Brad's wife and Eleanor's golden daughter looked absolutely feral. Her perfect, expensive blowout was deeply disheveled, and her designer silk gown was slipping carelessly off her shoulder. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. "Do not listen to her!" Chloe shrieked, spinning around wildly to face the shocked church congregation. "She is making all of this up. Those bank statements are completely fabricated. She is just a jealous, bitter woman trying to destroy our family because she knows she will never truly belong with us. She is lower-class trash." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to maintain my absolute authority. I simply tapped the screen of my encrypted smartphone and swiped my fingers smoothly to the left. The massive 85-inch monitor mounted above the marble fireplace instantly refreshed. Marcus and his disastrous offshore routing numbers disappeared entirely. They were replaced immediately by a heavily stamped confidential corporate document. The bold black header read, "Official Forensic Audit, St. Jude's Pediatric Care Foundation." I held the sleek silver microphone close to my lips. Is this fabricated too, Chloe? I asked, my voice echoing with lethal clinical precision through the surround sound speakers. The color entirely drained from Chloe's flushed face. She stumbled back a heavy step, her designer heels catching awkwardly on the thick edge of the Persian rug. Her manicured hand flew to her throat as she stared up at the massive glowing screen. Let us examine the reality of your flawless elite lifestyle. Chloe, I announced, pacing slowly along the top landing so every single guest could hear me perfectly. For the past 4 years, you have served as the Director of Charitable Giving for the Pediatric Oncology Wing at St. Jude's. It is a highly respected position, a deeply noble calling. This very church congregation has continuously praised your selfless dedication to sick children. You even accepted an award for it last spring, right here in this living room. I snapped my fingers again. A specific column on the massive screen highlighted in bright neon yellow, magnifying the brutal, indisputable mathematics. However, the independent forensic audit paints a vastly different picture. I continued, projecting my voice effortlessly over the murmuring crowd. Over the last 48 months, exactly $400,000 has been systematically siphoned from the Pediatric Charity Fund. The stolen money was routed through a highly complex web of dummy vendor accounts. And every single one of those fake corporate vendor accounts traces directly back to your personal private routing number, Chloe. The senior pastor literally dropped his champagne flute. The delicate crystal shattered loudly against the floor, spraying expensive sparkling wine across the polished wood, but nobody even looked down. The elite guests were too busy staring at the irrefutable high-definition proof of Chloe's monumental theft. You used charity donations meant specifically for dying children to fund your fake luxury lifestyle, I stated, my tone laced with absolute, unyielding disgust. You bought your summer home in the Hamptons, your fleet of imported sports cars, and your endless closet of designer gowns with money stolen directly from the families of pediatric cancer patients. Chloe began to shake violently. The undeniable proof was blinding her. The harsh, judgmental stares of her elite peers were rapidly stripping away her carefully constructed armor, leaving her entirely exposed. "You do not understand," she cried out, her voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate whine. "I was under so much pressure. You have no idea what it was like growing up in this family, Maya. Eleanor demanded absolute perfection every single day. I had to look the part. I had to keep up appearances to secure Brad's incredibly wealthy business connections. It was the culture I was raised in. I was conditioned to maintain the highest standard at all costs. I did not have a choice." I cut her off sharply, my voice cracking like a whip through the grand living room. "Do not you dare stand there and blame your upbringing for your own calculated, relentless greed, Chloe," I demanded. I walked slowly down the remaining stairs, closing the distance until I was standing just a few feet away from her shivering form. The security guards remained perfectly still, keeping Marcus pinned to the floor right beside us. "You had every conceivable privilege this world has to offer," I said, staring directly into her terrified, wide eyes. "You were raised in a mansion. You attended the absolute finest private academies. You had private tutors, endless trust funds, and a massive network of wealthy connections handed to you on a silver platter. You never once had to worry about where your next meal was coming from or how you were going to pay your rent. You had absolutely everything." I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice, but ensuring the microphone still carried my sharp words to the very back of the silent room. "Yet with all of that incredible privilege, you still consciously chose to steal from families who were literally bankrupting themselves, trying to save their sick children. You stole their hope and their financial ruin so you could buy another sports car and impress people who do not even care about you. You are not a victim of societal pressure, Chloe. You are a predator." Chloe let out a devastated, agonizing sob, covering her face entirely with her shaking hands. Her elite social circle was actively backing away from her, muttering their absolute horror and profound disgust. The foundation of her entire existence had been publicly and permanently annihilated. Desperate for salvation, Chloe spun around, frantically searching the crowd for the one person who was supposed to protect her. "Brad," she wailed, reaching her trembling hands out toward the back of the room. "Brad, tell them we had to do it for the firm. Help me." The crowd parted slightly, revealing Brad's position. He was not rushing forward to defend his wife. He was not shouting legal threats or trying to shield her from the overwhelming public humiliation. Brad was standing near the heavy oak doors leading directly to the outdoor terrace. His face was a tight mask of cold, calculated self-preservation. As Chloe cried out his name, he did not move toward her. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step backward, then another. He was silently backing toward the exit, keeping his eyes darting frantically toward the front gates, where the distant wail of approaching police sirens could finally be heard, echoing through the night. Brad was actively abandoning his wife to the wolves, perfectly willing to let her take the fall if it meant he could somehow escape the fiery wreckage of their stolen empire. "Not so fast, Brad," I called out. My voice cut through the ambient panic in the room like a physical blade. Brad froze instantly. His hand hovered a mere inch from the heavy brass handle of the terrace door. He slowly turned his head to look at me. His usual arrogant posture had completely vanished. The broad-shouldered, intimidating corporate bully was gone, replaced entirely by the cornered look of a panicked, desperate animal. "This is a misunderstanding, Maya," he stammered, holding both his hands up in a gesture of fake surrender. He took a cautious step away from the door, his eyes darting wildly around the room. I had absolutely no idea what Chloe was doing with those charity funds. I am just as shocked as everyone else in this room. My financial firm operates entirely separate from her philanthropic endeavors. I need to step outside and call my legal counsel immediately to clear my name. "You are not calling anyone," I stated, walking purposefully toward the center of the room. My emerald gown dragged heavily across the marble, but I did not break eye contact with him for a single second. "Do you really think you can just slither out the back door and let your wife take the fall alone? You think you can abandon your own family the second the spotlight turns toward your dirty money? You think your hands are clean just because you wear a custom Italian suit and sit on the board of urban development committees?" I tapped the screen of my phone. The massive monitor above the fireplace shifted away from Chloe's catastrophic hospital audit. A stark black screen appeared in its place, displaying a jagged neon blue digital audio waveform. "You have spent your entire career playing the ultimate white savior, Brad," I announced, pacing before the stunned congregation. "You love attending those high-profile urban development galas. You love smiling for the press cameras while handing out oversized novelty checks to minority community centers. You built an entire public persona on being the generous corporate benefactor uplifting the inner city. You shake hands with community leaders and promise them a brighter future. Let us hear what you actually think about the communities you claim to save." I hit play on my phone. The audio was crystal clear. It was a recording taken from a closed-door executive meeting at Brad's private equity firm. His arrogant, booming baritone filled the living room, completely unedited and undeniably his. "These neighborhoods are absolute gold mines if you know how to squeeze them right." Brad's recorded voice sneered over the speakers, followed by the distinct sound of ice clinking in a Scotch glass. "They do not have the legal representation to fight back. We redline the blocks, we jack up the interest rates on the revitalization loans, and the second they inevitably default, we sweep in and seize the deeds. It is a perfectly legal Ponzi scheme disguised as urban renewal. We bleed them dry, and they should be thanking us for gentrifying their slums." The recording ended with a chorus of cruel, dismissive laughter from Brad and his corporate associates. The silence that followed in the grand foyer was suffocating. The air grew thick with absolute, profound revulsion. The city councilwoman who Chloe had shoved earlier stared at Brad with pure, murderous rage. Several other minority business leaders and church elders who had previously praised Brad's charitable efforts now looked at him as if he were a diseased insect. The polished, benevolent corporate mask was ripped away permanently. It left nothing but a cowardly, racist fraudster, exposed under the harsh, bright lights of his own living room. Brad began to visibly tremble. Sweat poured down his face, ruining the expensive starched collar of his custom-tailored shirt. "Maya," he gasped, taking another step backward toward the heavy oak doors. "That audio is doctored. It is AI-generated nonsense. You cannot prove any of this in a court of law." "I do not need to prove it to this congregation, Brad," I replied. my tone dropping to a deadly, uncompromising whisper. I already sent the unredacted financial ledgers matching your predatory loan defaults directly to the state attorney general. You built your entire private equity firm on a foundation of systemic extortion. You targeted low-income minority families who were desperate for a lifeline. You offered them loans that were specifically mathematically designed to bankrupt them. You intentionally stole their generational wealth to line your own offshore accounts. You are not a savior, you are a parasite. You. Brad turned frantically and grabbed the brass handle of the terrace door. He yanked it downward, throwing his entire body weight against the heavy oak panel. He grunted with exertion, pulling wildly in a desperate, pathetic bid to break free and escape into the dark, sprawling gardens. The door did not budge even a fraction of an inch. I locked the perimeter doors through the smart home network when I locked the television. Brad, I informed him, watching his frantic struggle with cold, clinical satisfaction. You are not going anywhere. He spun around, pressing his back flat against the glass panes of the door. He looked from his sobbing wife on the floor, to his pinned brother-in-law, to his catatonic mother-in-law. Eleanor was still gripping the acrylic podium, her eyes wide and vacant, completely broken by the systematic public destruction of her flawless family dynasty. Brad realized with absolute certainty that no one was going to help him. The elite guests were actively backing away, treating him like a highly volatile threat. Please, Brad begged, sliding slowly down the glass door until he was crouching pathetically on the marble floor. I will give you whatever you want, Maya. Name your price right now. I can transfer millions in untraceable funds to your account immediately. Just unlock the door and let me walk away before it is too late. I just want you to face reality, Brad, I said, standing tall amidst the smoking ruins of the Jenkins family empire. At that exact moment, the wailing of the sirens reached a deafening, overwhelming pitch. The sounds surrounded the estate, entirely echoing aggressively off the marble walls and vibrating heavily through the expensive hardwood floorboards. Suddenly, brilliant, strobing flashes of red and blue light pierced the darkness outside. The harsh, rapid lights flooded through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, painting Brad's terrified face in alternating chaotic colors. Heavy boots pounded aggressively against the front porch steps, followed by a series of violently loud, authoritative knocks that threatened to shake the main entrance right off its hinges. The FBI had arrived at the party. The heavy oak doors did not just open, they violently burst inward, striking the marble walls with a deafening crack. A rush of crisp night air flooded the suffocating heat of the grand foyer, bringing with it the sharp static of police radios and the chaotic, overlapping shouts of federal agents. More than a dozen men and women wearing dark tactical gear and navy blue windbreakers with bright yellow FBI lettering poured into the living room. They moved with terrifying military precision, fanning out across the Persian rugs and taking immediate, absolute control of the estate. The elite congregation of St. Jude's Cathedral scattered like frightened insects. Women in expensive silk gowns shrieked and pulled their husbands backward, scrambling desperately to get out of the line of fire. But they did not look away. In fact, the sheer morbid curiosity of the Atlanta elite instantly overrode their panic. Hundreds of sleek smartphones were suddenly raised high into the air. The bright white flashes of camera lenses illuminated the grand foyer, turning the high society gathering into a ruthless paparazzi feeding frenzy. The same people who had happily drank Eleanor's expensive champagne just an hour ago were now eagerly documenting the exact moment the untouchable Jenkins family finally fell from grace. They wanted front-row seats to the absolute carnage. Federal agents secure the perimeter, a tall lead agent barked, stepping into the center of the room. Nobody leaves this building until we have confirmed all primary targets. Brad made a fatal miscalculation. He took one look at the armed agents swarming the foyer and decided his massive corporate ego could somehow negotiate his way out of a federal raid. He pushed himself off the glass terrace door, straightening his ruined custom jacket, and raised his hands in a placating, condescending gesture. He genuinely believed his vast wealth made him entirely immune to consequences. Listen to me, officers, Brad announced, puffing out his chest and attempting to project his booming boardroom voice. There is a massive misunderstanding here. I am Bradley Jenkins. I sit on the board of the Regional Development Committee. I have the mayor on speed dial. If you just let me make one phone call to my legal team, we can sort out whatever paperwork error caused this ridiculous intrusion. The agents did not care about his golf handicap or his powerful political connections. Two massive agents lunged forward, closing the distance in 3 rapid strides. Brad let out a startled, pathetic yelp as they grabbed him by the lapels of his expensive Italian suit. They spun him around violently and slammed him face first against the reinforced glass of the terrace door. The brutal impact shook the heavy panes loudly. Bradley Jenkins, you are under arrest for systemic real estate fraud, extortion, and racketeering, the agent growled, pulling Brad's arms roughly behind his back. The cold steel handcuffs clicked loudly, echoing through the silent room as they locked tightly around Brad's wrists. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you start using it immediately. Chloe watched her husband being physically restrained and let out a blood-curdling scream. She backed away from him, shrinking into the corner like a terrified child, crying hysterically as the harsh reality of her ruined life finally set in. Her stolen charity money, her luxury cars, her pristine social standing, they were all gone, permanently erased by the very justice system she thought she could effortlessly outsmart. The elite church wives actively recording her total breakdown showed absolutely no mercy. Across the room, my 2 private security guards immediately stepped back, raising their empty hands to signal their full compliance to the entering federal authorities. They left Marcus groaning on the floor. A second team of federal agents immediately descended upon him. They hauled the former chief financial officer up by his armpits, dragging him roughly to his knees. Marcus looked absolutely hollowed out. His expensive suit was torn. His face was badly bruised from hitting the marble floor, and tears streamed continuously down his pale, sweating cheeks. He looked around wildly, making brief, agonizing eye contact with the prominent church elders, who were currently filming his public humiliation on their phones. He was a completely broken shell of a man. Marcus Jenkins, an agent, stated, pulling out a pair of handcuffs and locking them brutally onto his wrists. You are under arrest for multiple counts of federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and document forgery. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. He sagged completely, letting his entire body weight hang limply between the 2 holding agents. He did not fight. He did not argue. The undeniable proof of his offshore routing numbers was still glowing brightly in perfect 4K resolution on the massive screen right above his head, serving as a brutal, unquestionable backdrop for his highly publicized arrest. The swift, tactical takedown of the 2 golden suns finally broke the spell holding the matriarch captive. Eleanor snapped out of her catatonic state. The sheer magnitude of the disrespect happening inside her own home ignited a delusional, fiery rage deep within her chest. She let go of the acrylic podium, marching forward with an absurd, furious sense of pure entitlement. She simply could not comprehend a world where her strict authority was not absolute. "Stop this right now!" Eleanor shrieked, her voice vibrating with hysterical, demanding authority. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at the lead FBI agent. "How dare you barge into my home and manhandle my family? Do you have any idea who we are? We are the Jenkins family. We are the absolute pillars of this community. We donate millions to the church. We fund the hospital wings. We own this city. You cannot just walk in here and treat us like common street criminals. I will have your badge for this. I will call the governor. I will see to it that you are completely ruined." The lead FBI agent did not flinch. He did not look intimidated by her immense wealth, her aggressive, demanding posture, or her entirely empty political threats. He stood perfectly still, letting her unhinged, arrogant rant echo endlessly through the grand living room until she finally ran out of breath. He slowly pulled a folded federal warrant from the inside pocket of his navy blue windbreaker, unfolding the paper with deliberate, agonizing slowness. He looked Eleanor directly in the eye with an expression of absolute freezing contempt. "We know exactly who you are, ma'am," the lead agent said, his voice carrying a quiet, devastating finality that silenced the entire room. "You are the registered public notary who officially stamped the forged deed on the commercial real estate loan. You personally authorized the fraudulent transfer of $2 million. Put your hands behind your back. The metallic ratcheting sound of the heavy steel handcuffs echoed sharply against the vaulted ceilings. Eleanor Jenkins, the untouchable matriarch of Atlanta elite society, let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp. A female federal agent grabbed Eleanor's wrists, pulling them forcefully behind her back with practiced military efficiency. The sudden, aggressive movement caused Eleanor's perfectly styled hair to fall completely out of place. Her heavy diamond necklace swung wildly, catching the harsh glare of the massive television screen still displaying her family's financial crimes. She tried to pull away her expensive silk gown, rustling loudly against the agent's tactical gear, but the federal officer did not budge an inch. The agent secured the cuffs with a brutal final click. For the first time in her entirely privileged existence, Eleanor was physically restrained. Her eyes darted frantically around the grand foyer, searching for a sympathetic face among the sea of prominent politicians and wealthy real estate tycoons. She expected someone, anyone, to step forward and demand her immediate release. She expected her influence to act as an impenetrable shield. She found absolutely nothing but open, glaring disgust. The people who had worshipped her bank accounts just an hour ago were now treating her like a toxic, hazardous spill. They whispered furiously among themselves, holding their phones high to record her total destruction. The crowd parted forcefully as Bishop Thomas stepped forward. His face was flushed a deep, angry crimson. His hands trembled visibly by his sides. This was the man Eleanor had hosted for countless private dinners, the man she had manipulated for a decade to secure her position as the undisputed president of the church board. He stopped inches away from where Eleanor stood in her federal restraints. He looked from the glowing monitor displaying the embezzled charity funds down to her cowering, handcuffed form. "Eleanor Jenkins!" He began, his booming voice shaking the crystal fixtures above them. "You have stood at the altar of my sanctuary and prayed for the poor. You have taken the communion wine and smiled in the faces of my most vulnerable parishioners. And all the while you were signing fraudulent documents to steal their shelter. You were endorsing the theft of pediatric cancer funds to maintain this grotesque monument to your own vanity." He gestured aggressively to the opulent surroundings, pointing a shaking finger at the marble pillars and the Persian rugs. The absolute silence in the room amplified his every word. Therefore Bishop Thomas continued his tone, dropping to a cold, thunderous judgment by the authority vested in me by St. Jude's Cathedral. I am officially and publicly stripping you of your title as president of the church board. You are permanently removed from all charitable committees, all financial oversight councils, and all sanctuary operations. Your ungodly criminal actions have brought profound disgrace upon our congregation. You are no longer welcome in our house of worship. The absolute finality of the bishop's condemnation struck Eleanor like a physical blow to the chest. Her knees buckled slightly. The female agent had to haul her upward by her biceps to keep her from collapsing onto the polished floor. Her entire kingdom had evaporated in less than 20 minutes. The church, the high society connections, her untouchable reputation, they were all completely obliterated. She whipped her head around and locked her terrified, bloodshot eyes entirely on me. "Maya," she cried out, her voice cracking into a desperate, pathetic wail. She actively pulled against the FBI agent trying to stumble in my direction. "Maya, please, you have to stop this. You have to tell them it is a mistake. Tell them Marcus handled the paperwork, and I just signed where he told me to. Tell them this is just a terrible family misunderstanding. We can fix this. I will give you anything you want. I will rewrite the family trust. I will publicly apologize to you right now. Just please do not let them take me out of my own home in handcuffs." I walked slowly across the polished marble floor. I stopped directly in front of her, looking down at the shivering, ruined woman who had made it her absolute mission to make my life a living hell. The red and blue police lights from outside strobed violently across her pale, sweating face. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of pity. I just looked at her with pure clinical satisfaction. "Do you remember the day my parents died, Eleanor?" I asked, my words slicing cleanly through her hysterical sobbing. "Do you remember standing in that freezing funeral parlor while I wept over their closed caskets? I was 20 years old. My entire world had just been completely destroyed. And do you remember exactly what you told me when I asked you for just a fraction of emotional support to help me process the absolute worst tragedy of my life? Eleanor stared at me, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. She knew exactly what she had said. I leaned in close, ensuring the microphone picked up every single syllable. I repeated her exact vile words back to her. The Lord works in mysterious ways, Eleanor. Count your blessings. A choked, agonizing sob tore through Eleanor's throat. The federal agent firmly grasped her upper arm, turning her sharply toward the massive front doors. "It is time to go, ma'am," the agent stated authoritatively. The armed tactical team began marching Eleanor, Brad, and Marcus simultaneously toward the grand exit. The flashing police cruisers waiting on the front lawn illuminated the terrifying reality of their immediate future. They were going straight to federal holding cells. Their elite lives were officially over. As the agent dragged Eleanor past me, I reached into the hidden pocket of my emerald gown. I pulled out a thick, crisp white envelope bearing the official seal of a prominent international banking conglomerate. I stepped smoothly into Eleanor's path, forcing the FBI agent to pause for a brief fraction of a second. I reached out and tucked the heavy envelope securely into the front pocket of Eleanor's ruined silk designer gown. "Oh, by the way, Eleanor," I said, projecting my voice so the entire congregation could hear the final nail being driven into her coffin. "I used the profits from my independent tech company to completely purchase the commercial debt your son fraudulently leveraged against this estate. I am the primary lien holder now. And since your accounts are currently frozen under federal investigation, you are in immediate catastrophic default." I smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile as the federal agents pushed her toward the waiting squad cars. "You do not live here anymore, Eleanor. You are evicted." The harsh fluorescent lights of the federal field office provided a stark, brutal contrast to the warm crystal chandeliers of the Jenkins estate. Less than 12 hours had passed since I watched Eleanor get shoved into the back of a police cruiser, and I had not slept a single wink. I stood with my arms crossed perfectly still, staring through the thick pane of two-way glass. Beside me stood Victoria, my lead counsel, and her elite team of forensic accountants. We held steaming cups of black coffee in absolute silence, watching the wall of security monitors that displayed 3 separate interrogation rooms in perfect high definition. The pristine, unified Jenkins family had already shattered into a million jagged pieces. They were no longer the untouchable dynasty that had made my life a living hell. Stripped of their designer gowns, their champagne flutes, and their gated mansions, they were nothing more than cornered, desperate animals, violently clawing over each other to avoid drowning. I reached forward and tapped the audio feed for Interrogation Room A. Brad was pacing the length of the small concrete room, like a rabid, caged dog. His custom-tailored Italian suit was severely wrinkled, and he had sweat entirely through the collar of his expensive silk shirt. 2 federal agents sat completely unbothered at the metal table, letting him exhaust himself with his own panicked adrenaline. "I am telling you, I am the actual victim here," Brad shouted, slamming his heavy palms against the metal table. "I run a legitimate, highly respected private equity firm. Do you understand the strict vetting process my company goes through? Marcus Jenkins is the one who brought this toxic, radioactive mess to my doorstep. You need to look deeply at his background. Look at where he came from before my foolish sister married him." Brad leaned in closer, his face twisted in a mask of desperate, ugly superiority. "He grew up with absolutely nothing." Brad spat, his voice dripping with venomous classist disgust. "He has that ghetto desperation baked right into his DNA. He saw my family's charitable foundation and his eyes lit up. He manipulated the financial ledgers to siphon those pediatric funds because he possesses a trailer park mentality. He dragged my pristine corporate name into the mud to fund his own pathetic, massive insecurities. I will testify against him right now. I will give you every single offshore routing number, every hidden digital ledger, every dummy corporation he set up. Just draft my immunity agreement and let me walk out of here." Victoria chuckled darkly beside me, taking a slow sip of her coffee. "There is absolutely no loyalty among thieves," she murmured, leaning against the glass. "He is serving his own brother-in-law on a silver platter without a single ounce of hesitation." I switched the audio feed to room B. Eleanor sat completely rigid, her hands cuffed securely to the heavy metal bar bolted across the table. She looked utterly devastated. Her immaculate salon blowout was matted flat to her forehead, and her waterproof mascara had run down her pale cheeks in dark, jagged lines. But her absolute delusion and arrogance remained entirely intact. "I demand to speak to the governor immediately," Eleanor dictated, her voice trembling but intensely haughty. "I am the innocent victim of two deeply incompetent, greedy men. My son-in-law, Brad, is a ruthless corporate predator who manipulated my signature for his own gain. And Marcus is a useless gold digger who poisoned this entire family the exact second he walked through our doors. I am a recognized pillar of the community. I dedicate my entire life to the church. I was tricked into signing those commercial loans." The federal agent sitting across from her did not argue. He simply slid a glossy stack of wire transfer authorizations across the table. Every single document bore Eleanor's distinct, flawless signature perfectly aligned right next to her official notary stamp. She stared down at the undeniable concrete proof of her active, willing participation in the fraud, and her jaw snapped shut. The matriarch was finally out of excuses. I reached out and unmuted room C. Marcus sat slumped in a hard plastic chair, looking like a man who had rapidly aged 20 years overnight. He was shivering violently, staring blankly at the gray concrete wall. The federal prosecutor, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Agent Miller, sat across from him, organizing a thick stack of files. "Brad orchestrated the entire thing," Marcus pleaded, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "He threatened my career. He told me if I did not root the pediatric charity funds into his dummy corporations, he would have Eleanor permanently fire me from the family trust. They conditioned me to do this. Eleanor demanded a lavish lifestyle I could not afford to provide for her daughter. They pushed me into a corner. I was just following their strict orders to keep my marriage intact and keep my job safe." I stared at the monitor, feeling absolutely nothing for the man who had promised to love and protect me. He was perfectly willing to blame his upbringing, his boss, his mother-in-law, and his wife for his own catastrophic greed. He was a complete coward, entirely stripped of his arrogant bravado. Agent Miller opened a thick manila folder and extracted two very specific documents. She placed them face down on the cold metal table, sliding them smoothly toward Marcus. "We have Brad's full sworn confession," Marcus Agent Miller stated with lethal clinical precision. "He has officially turned state's evidence against you. He voluntarily handed over the encrypted hard drives linking you directly to the document forgery and the offshore embezzlement. He threw you completely under the bus. Your mother-in-law Eleanor has also provided a sworn statement claiming you orchestrated the entire fraud scheme behind her back to steal her wealth." Marcus gasped out loud, clutching his chest as if he had been physically struck. He looked wildly around the windowless room, realizing with absolute horrifying certainty that his elite family had brutally severed ties with him to save their own skins. He was entirely alone. "You are facing 25 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, document forgery, and racketeering." Agent Miller continued, her tone entirely devoid of pity. "However, the federal prosecution is prepared to offer you a highly unconventional plea agreement." Marcus grabbed the edge of the metal table, his eyes wide with desperate, frantic hope. "Anything," he begged, leaning forward. "I will take absolutely anything you offer." Agent Miller flipped the two documents over. The first was a standard federal plea deal. The second was a thick, legally binding contract stamped prominently with the logo of Victoria's law firm. "The primary victim of your financial crimes, Maya Jenkins, has seized all commercial debt attached to your entire estate," Agent Miller explained, her voice echoing sharply in the small room. "She is currently working in full cooperation with the federal government to recover the stolen hospital assets. The district attorney is willing to reduce your sentence to 5 years in a minimum security facility. But there is a strict non-negotiable condition attached to this leniency." Marcus stared down at the crisp white papers, his hands shaking violently. "What is the condition?" he whispered, his voice completely broken. "You will sign a full, unconditional divorce decree, right here, right now." Agent Miller commanded, tapping the second document heavily with her silver pen. You will permanently relinquish every single asset, every offshore bank account, and every piece of physical property directly to Maya. You walk away with absolutely nothing, or you spend the next quarter of a century rotting in a federal penitentiary. The choice is yours. Marcus stared at the thick, legally binding document sitting on the cold metal table. His breathing was shallow and ragged. He slowly lifted his head and looked directly at the two-way glass mirror. He knew I was standing right behind it. He could not see me, but his terrified, bloodshot eyes searched the dark-tinted surface, seeking a final ounce of the mercy he had so brutally denied me. I offered absolutely nothing. Please, Marcus whispered, his voice cracking. Maya, if you can hear me, I am so sorry. I lost my way. I let them manipulate me. Please do not take everything. I will have nothing left. Agent Miller slammed her hand flat against the table. The sharp crack made Marcus flinch violently. Your ex-wife is not negotiating with you, Marcus, Agent Miller stated sharply. She is dictating the terms of your survival. You either pick up that pen and sign away your entire stolen life, or I call the marshals back in here and process your transfer to a federal holding facility. I will give you exactly 10 seconds to decide. 10, 9, 8. Marcus broke completely. A pathetic, agonizing sob tore from his throat. He lunged forward, grabbing the silver pen with trembling, sweaty hands. He hastily scribbled his signature across the bottom of the divorce decree. He flipped to the next page, signing away the deed to the house. He flipped again, signing over the offshore accounts, the investment portfolios, the luxury vehicles, and his entire fraudulent retirement fund. He relinquished every single asset he had accumulated during our entire marriage. The heavy scratching of the pen echoed through the speaker system like music. Beside me, Victoria closed her leather portfolio with a satisfying snap. Total unconditional surrender, she noted, a sharp, triumphant smile playing on her lips. You are officially free, Maya. He has absolutely nothing left to his name. The fallout from that afternoon was swift and utterly merciless. The federal government moved with devastating speed, annihilating the Jenkins family empire in a matter of hours. Brad's highly publicized downfall was broadcast live on every major news network in Atlanta. Heavily armed federal agents raided his private equity firm, carrying out dozens of boxes of hard drives and financial ledgers. Brad was forced to watch from the back of a police cruiser as flatbed tow trucks hauled away his custom Ferrari and his imported sports cars. The government seized his bank accounts, froze his assets, and placed a massive federal lien on his sprawling suburban estate. The arrogant white savior of urban development was publicly exposed as a predatory monster facing decades behind bars. Chloe was systematically destroyed. The hospital board convened an emergency session and voted unanimously to terminate her position as director of charitable giving. The state medical board permanently revoked her philanthropic licenses, and the district attorney officially indicted her for felony embezzlement. Stripped of her stolen wealth and facing her own highly publicized criminal trial, Chloe was forced to face a brutal reality check. Just 3 days later, Chloe stood in the harsh fluorescent lighting of a local discount grocery store. Her designer silk gowns were gone, replaced by a faded plain cotton sweater and cheap denim jeans. Her perfect, expensive blowout had faded into a frizzy, unkempt mess, and her once flawless manicured nails were chipped and broken. She stood nervously at the customer service counter, staring down at a wrinkled paper job application. A bored teenage manager, snapping a piece of pink bubblegum, handed her a cheap plastic pen. Fill out the employment history on the back, the teenager mumbled, barely looking up from her phone. And we need 2 references that are not family members. Starting pay is minimum wage and you have to work weekend night shifts. Do you have a problem with cleaning the public restrooms? Chloe swallowed hard, her hands shaking as she took the cheap pen. The woman who used to sip imported champagne and mock the working class was now desperately applying for a cashier position just to afford her mounting legal fees. No, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the cheap fluorescent lights. I do not have a problem with that. but the most spectacular downfall belonged entirely to Eleanor Jenkins. With her federal assets completely frozen and her grand estate legally seized by me, Eleanor was unceremoniously thrown onto the street. The former queen of Atlanta high society was forced to haul her meager remaining possessions in black plastic garbage bags up 3 flights of stairs to a tiny rundown apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. The cramped studio smelled heavily of boiled cabbage and stale cigarette smoke. Peeling yellow wallpaper hung in sad drooping strips from the damp walls. The single window looked out over a noisy, congested highway and a brightly lit gas station. Eleanor sat alone on a cheap stained mattress she had found at a thrift store. She wore a faded bathrobe clutching her knees to her chest. She stared blankly at the cracked linoleum floor, listening to the aggressive shouting of her new neighbors through the paper-thin walls. The woman who had demanded absolute perfection and built her identity on elite superiority was now completely isolated, rotting away in the exact type of impoverished slum she had spent her entire life ruthlessly mocking. She had absolutely no one left to manipulate. Miles away, I stood in the exact center of my grand foyer. The estate was entirely silent. The federal agents were gone. The panicked elite guests had fled. The toxic, suffocating presence of the Jenkins family had been permanently eradicated from the premises. The afternoon sun streamed beautifully through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the polished marble floors and the pristine Persian rugs. I looked down at the heavy brass keys resting in the palm of my hand. These were the keys Marcus had tried to take from me. The keys to the empire Eleanor had tried to steal. The keys to the home Brad and Chloe had tried to leverage for their own pathetic greed. I closed my fingers tightly around the cool metal, feeling the absolute, undeniable weight of my hard-won victory. I had reclaimed my property. I had completely destroyed the monsters who murdered my family. I had won. But as I stood in this beautiful, quiet warmth of my restored home, my encrypted smartphone buzzed heavily in my pocket. I pulled it out and stared at the screen. A single, untraceable message had just arrived from an encrypted offshore server. The story was not over yet. I had one last final move to make. The screen of my phone illuminated with a blinding white light displaying a secure transfer authorization. My tech team had finally cracked the last remaining firewall shielding Brad's offshore Cayman accounts. The digital ledger confirmed that the final $50 million he had siphoned from minority business owners was completely vulnerable. I did not hesitate. I tapped the execute command. In a matter of seconds, the illicit funds were legally drained, rerouted, and secured into an ironclad trust under my maiden name. Brad's secret financial lifeline was permanently severed. That was the final nail. The slate was completely wiped clean. 6 months later, the grand estate buzzed with an entirely different kind of energy. The stifling, toxic atmosphere of Eleanor's high society church galas was completely gone. In its place was a vibrant, joyful celebration of genuine community. The heavy velvet drapes had been torn down, letting the warm Georgia sunlight flood the massive rooms. The sterile classical music was replaced by a live jazz band playing bright, soulful melodies. The air smelled of incredible catered Southern food, instead of the cheap, overly perfumed hors d'oeuvres Eleanor used to force upon her fake friends. I walked through the crowded living room holding a glass of sparkling cider. The people standing in my home tonight were not corrupt real estate tycoons or hypocritical politicians. They were local community organizers, pro bono civil rights attorneys, and working-class families who had survived the exact predatory lending schemes Brad had orchestrated. I had invited the actual backbone of Atlanta to celebrate a rebirth. I wore a tailored emerald pantsuit that fit perfectly, radiating absolute confidence. Every person I passed offered genuine warm congratulations. There were no hidden agendas here. There was only shared triumph. I stepped up to the grand staircase, tapping a silver spoon against my crystal glass. The joyful chatter slowly faded into a respectful, expectant silence. Every eye in the massive foyer turned toward me. "Thank you all for being here tonight." I began projecting my voice so it carried clearly to the back of the room. For a very long time, this house represented greed, manipulation, and the absolute worst of elite entitlement. The people who previously owned this estate built their wealth by stepping on the necks of hardworking families. They exploited loopholes, they forged signatures, and they laughed at the destruction they left behind. But tonight, we are permanently reclaiming this space. We are taking back the power. I walked over to the center of the foyer, where a massive frame stood draped in heavy emerald velvet. It stood exactly where Eleanor used to display a grotesque, overly dramatic portrait of herself. 22 years ago, my parents started a modest community bank. I said, my voice thick with genuine emotion, but entirely steady. They sacrificed absolutely everything. They worked grueling 80-hour weeks. They sat at our tiny kitchen table late into the night, reviewing loan applications for people the major banks refused to look at. They skipped vacations and ignored their own exhaustion to ensure that families in our community had a fair, honest chance at owning a home. They operated on handshakes and integrity. I looked around the room, making eye contact with the crowd. They were mocked by the elite class, I continued. They were called small-minded for refusing to exploit their own people. The Jenkins family tried to erase that sacrifice. They tried to tell me my parents' legacy was worthless simply because it was not built on ruthless corporate greed. I gripped the edge of the velvet fabric. They were dead wrong, I stated fiercely. I pulled the fabric down. The heavy velvet fell to the polished marble floor, revealing a breathtaking floor-to-ceiling oil portrait of my mother and father. They were painted standing together, holding hands, looking out with warm, proud smiles. The artist had captured the vibrant, resilient spirit in their eyes perfectly. Gasps of awe and thunderous applause erupted throughout the foyer. I looked up at my parents, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. Their legacy was no longer a footnote. It was the absolute, undeniable centerpiece of the estate. When the applause finally settled, I raised my hand. In honor of their 22 years of unbroken sacrifice, I am officially launching the Carter Equity Foundation. I announced the words ringing with absolute authority. Using the recovered assets from the recent federal seizures, we are opening a $200 million legal and financial defense fund. Our sole mission is to aggressively protect minority homeowners from predatory lending practices, shell corporation scams, and corporate theft. We will provide elite legal representation to anyone facing the kind of financial terrorism that Brad Jenkins tried to normalize. We are going to ensure that no hardworking family is ever bullied out of their generational wealth again. The room erupted into deafening cheers. People were crying, raising their glasses, and hugging each other. The heavy, dark shadow of the Jenkins family was permanently banished, replaced by a fierce, protective light. I had not just taken their empire, I had actively repurposed it to destroy their entire toxic industry. As the celebration roared on around me, I quietly slipped out through the French doors. I stepped onto the expansive wraparound porch, letting the warm evening breeze wash over me. The Georgia sunset was painting the sky in brilliant shades of amber and deep violet. I leaned against the sturdy wooden railing, taking a deep breath of the fresh, clean air. I had survived the absolute worst betrayal imaginable, and I had built an impenetrable fortress from the wreckage. My encrypted phone vibrated sharply against my palm. I glanced down at the caller ID. It was the CEO of a massive Silicon Valley tech conglomerate. I answered the call, listening intently for a few moments as the executive frantically laid out the terms of a massive merger. Yes, I replied, my voice smooth and commanding. A $40 million acquisition of my proprietary software is an acceptable starting point. But my legal team will retain 30% of the voting rights, and I retain full creative control. Have your people send the contract to my office by Monday morning. I ended the call before he could even argue. A slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across my face. I looked out over the sprawling green lawn, watching the fireflies begin to light up the twilight. I dropped the heavy brass keys to my estate into my designer leather bag. I smoothed the lapel of my tailored blazer, turned on my heel, and walked back inside to join the party. I was the architect of my own destiny. I was entirely untouchable. I was completely unbothered. The screen fades to black on her powerful, unbothered smile. The story of Maya teaches us that true power comes from resilience, not from elite status or manipulation. Betrayal by those closest to us can temporarily break us, but it can also be the ultimate catalyst for our greatest transformation. Her journey proves that maintaining your integrity while reclaiming your worth is the ultimate victory. She dismantled a toxic empire not with mindless revenge, but with calculated justice, unapologetically reclaiming her parents' legacy. When you trust your own unwavering strength, you become completely untouchable. Please share your empowering story below if you have survived and defeated a toxic family dynamic.